Hi, I'm David. At my own wedding, in front of every single person I loved and respected, my own father raised a glass and toasted me by calling me a janitor. That was the exact moment I understood that some voids can never be filled. Not even by the person who is supposed to be your biggest champion. It was a clean, sharp break, like a bone snapping in the cold. Have you ever felt completely and utterly invisible to the one person who was supposed to see you most clearly? Before I tell you about the sound his champagne flute made when it shattered on the marble floor a few minutes later, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the look on his face when the entire room found out who his janitor son really was. The whole affair was my father's masterpiece, not mine. The reception was held at one of those old money country clubs in Westchester, the kind with sprawling green lawns and stone facades that whispered about generations of wealth. Every detail, from the ridiculously oversized floral arrangements to the string quartet playing softly in the corner, was designed to scream one thing: success. My father, Richard, was a real estate magnate who built his empire from the ground up, and he never let anyone forget it. To him, a person's worth was measured in square footage and stock portfolios. My career serving as a cybersecurity analyst in an elite US military unit was something he couldn't quantify in dollars. Therefore, in his mind, it simply didn't count. It was a constant, unspoken battle between his world of concrete and my world of code. His favorite weapon was the nickname he'd given me, the janitor for soldiers. It wasn't just a casual joke. It was a carefully crafted insult, designed to diminish everything I did. He'd use it at family dinners, board meetings, and golf outings with his influential friends. He'd paint a picture of me sweeping floors on some forgotten army base, a menial laborer in a world of warriors, conveniently omitting the part where I protected national infrastructure from foreign cyber attacks. He refused to understand the details, because understanding would mean acknowledging its importance. It was easier to mock what he couldn't control, to shrink my world down until it was small enough for him to step on. His words were a slow drip poison I'd been swallowing for years. The hardest part wasn't enduring it myself, but seeing the pain it caused Emily, my wife. She knew the truth. She'd seen the late nights, the stress etched on my face after a critical incident, the quiet pride I took in my work. As my father stood there, a smug grin on his face, I didn't dare look at him. I looked at her. I saw the shimmer of tears in her eyes, the way her jaw tightened as she fought to maintain her composure for my sake. In that moment, her pain became my pain, magnified 1,000 times. She reached for my hand under the crisp white tablecloth, her grip firm and steady. It was a silent message. I'm here. I see you. That small gesture was the only thing keeping me anchored, the only thing stopping me from standing up and shattering the perfect, expensive illusion my father had built. My mother, Susan, was a ghost at the feast. She was beautiful, elegant, draped in a designer gown that probably cost more than my first car, but her presence was entirely passive. She floated through the room with a practiced smile, ensuring every guest was comfortable, every glass was full. But when my father delivered his verbal blows, she would simply find something else to look at, a flower arrangement, a distant cousin, the pattern on the wallpaper. Her silence was its own kind of betrayal. I stopped expecting her to defend me years ago, but on my wedding day, her averted gaze felt sharper than ever. It was the quiet confirmation that in the kingdom my father had built, he was the only one whose voice mattered. She was just another one of his beautiful, silent acquisitions. The ultimate symbol of his disapproval was a watch. For my college graduation, he'd promised me a Rolex, the same model he wore. It was more than a gift. It was an anointment, a welcome into his world of high-stakes deals and boardroom victories. I worked hard, got my degree, and waited. The day I told him I'd enlisted, he just laughed. He walked over to the mahogany box on his desk, opened it, and looked at the gleaming steel watch inside. Then he closed it and put it away. "What would a soldier need this for?" he'd asked, not unkindly, but with a finality that was crushing. "They tell you when to eat and when to sleep. You don't need to keep your own time." That watch, or the lack of it, became the physical manifestation of the approval I would never receive. Now, as he stood before the crowd, he tapped his crystal champagne flute with a spoon, and the room fell into a respectful hush. All eyes were on him. His business partners, A few local politicians, or the people whose respect he craved, they all looked at him with admiration. He was Richard, the Titan, the man who could bend the city's skyline to his will. I felt that old familiar knot of dread tighten in my stomach. I'd been here before, in 100 different rooms on 100 different occasions. It was always the same. The charming introduction, the self-deprecating joke, and then the inevitable casual demolition of his son. I glanced at Emily, forcing a weak smile, trying to pretend this was just another one of his harmless quirks. He raised his glass, the light catching the diamond on his pinky ring. "To my son, David," he began, his voice smooth and confident. The guest smiled, ready for a heartwarming tribute. "He didn't follow in my footsteps, which, as you all know, was a bit of a disappointment." A few polite, sycophantic chuckles rippled through the audience. He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes scanning the room before they landed on me. He held my gaze, and with a smile that was pure contempt, he delivered the final crushing blow. "But I suppose someone has to be a janitor for the soldiers, right?" "To David!" The room filled with a mix of forced laughter and stunned, awkward silence. The sound of it was deafening. In that instant, something inside me didn't break. It went perfectly, unnervingly still. The years of desperate hope, of trying to twist myself into a shape he might recognize as worthy, all of it just evaporated. It was like a switch had been flipped. The dull ache of his disapproval was gone, replaced by a cold, quiet clarity. I didn't look at my father. I didn't need to. My world had narrowed to a single point of focus. Emily. I watched a single tear trace a path down her cheek, and I felt a wave of resolve wash over me, so calm and so absolute it almost scared me. The game was over. He could have his toast. He could have his audience. He could have his laugh. I was done playing. My life, my real life, was sitting right next to me, squeezing my hand. And I would not let him tarnish it for one more second. The sound that followed his words was a strange, hollow thing. It wasn't the hearty laughter of a shared joke, but a scattered, uncomfortable tittering from his business associates, the kind of noise people make when they're not sure if they're supposed to find something funny, but are too afraid to stay silent. The rest of the room, filled with our friends and Emily's family, went quiet. It was a thick, heavy silence, the kind that absorbs all the air and light. I kept my eyes on Emily, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my reaction. Her hand tightened around mine, her knuckles white. That pressure was my reality. Everything else, the opulent room, the clinking glasses, my father's smug face, was just noise. He had turned my wedding into another one of his boardrooms, a place where he could assert his dominance, and I was just another line item he could write off as a loss. My father, Richard, didn't seem to notice the sudden chill in the air, or if he did, he reveled in it. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his champagne, his eyes sweeping across the room, as if he'd just delivered the most brilliant speech of his life. He was a performer, and this was his stage. The expensive tuxedo he wore, the Patek Philippe on his wrist gleaming under the chandeliers, it was all part of the costume. He wasn't just toasting his son. He was reinforcing his own narrative. He was the king and I was the court jester, there for his amusement and to serve as a cautionary tale for anyone who dared to choose a path different from his. He smiled, a thin, satisfied curl of his lips, and then moved on, seamlessly transitioning into an anecdote about a recent real estate deal in Manhattan, as if he hadn't just emotionally disemboweled me in front of 200 people. I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on us. My friends, guys from my unit who had taken leave to be there, looked on with a mixture of confusion and barely concealed anger. They knew the classified nature of my work, the stakes involved. To hear it reduced to janitorial duty was not just an insult to me, but to them as well. Emily's family, simple, good people from Ohio who had driven 12 hours to be here, looked utterly bewildered. Her father, a retired high school history teacher, had a look of such profound disappointment on his face, not in me, but in the man who was now his son-in-law's father. I saw him put a protective arm around his wife's shoulder. They were witnessing a kind of casual cruelty they couldn't comprehend, a world where family was just another asset to be leveraged or discarded. The worst part was seeing Emily's parents. They were proud of me. Her father had spent weeks reading up on cybersecurity, trying to understand my world so we could talk about it. He'd ask clumsy but earnest questions about firewalls and encryption, his eyes wide with genuine interest. Now, he just looked sad. He saw my father not as a powerful tycoon but as a bully. And he saw his daughter, his only child, marrying into a family where her husband was treated as a punchline. I felt a surge of protective anger so fierce it almost made me stand up. It wasn't about my pride anymore. My father had crossed a line. He hadn't just humiliated me. He had disrespected my wife and the family that had welcomed me with open arms without ever asking for a financial statement. That cold clarity I felt wasn't anger, not really. It was something deeper, a fundamental shift in my own internal architecture. For 27 years I had been orbiting him, a small dim planet circling a massive indifferent sun, constantly seeking a sliver of his light, a little bit of warmth. In that single moment with that one word, janitor, the gravity just switched off. I was free. The desperate need for his approval, the ache of his disappointment, it all just floated away. It was a strange, hollow feeling, but it was also liberating. I looked at Emily. At the tear she quickly wiped away, and I knew my new center of gravity. It was her, it was us. My father could keep his cold, empty universe. I was building my own. My mind flashed back to that mahogany box on his desk. The Rolex. It sat there for years, a silent testament to a future he'd planned for me. A future in his firm, wearing tailored suits, driving a German luxury car, and measuring my life in closing deals and profit margins. When I enlisted, he didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just showed me the watch one last time. A silent, powerful gesture that said, "This world is not for you. You have made your choice, and you will get none of its rewards." He saw my service not as a sacrifice or a duty, but as a rejection of him, of everything he had built. He couldn't wrap his head around a motivation that wasn't tied to a price tag or a status symbol. So he created a narrative he could understand. I was a failure, a menial worker, a janitor. My mother, as always, was a master of evasion. As the awkward silence lingered, she glided over to the wedding planner, her expression one of polite concern, and began discussing the timing for cutting the cake. Her back was turned to me, to my father, to the entire uncomfortable scene. It was a deliberate, practiced movement, a social maneuver she had perfected over decades of marriage to a difficult man. Her survival depended on her ability to not see, to not hear, to not feel anything that might disrupt the perfect facade of their life. Her silence wasn't just weakness. It was an active choice. She was an accomplice in my erasure, smoothing over the cracks my father made, so the surface of their world would remain pristine and unbroken. Her loyalty was to the empire, not to her son. The music from the string quartet started up again, a gentle, elegant melody that felt completely at odds with the tension gripping our table. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. My collar felt too tight, the air too thin. I focused on the intricate lace pattern on the tablecloth, tracing it with my eyes, trying to ground myself. It was the little details that were so suffocating, the sheer expense of it all, the knowledge that he had paid for this entire spectacle only to use it as a platform to demean me. Every beautiful flower, every perfectly folded napkin felt like a prop in his personal play. He wasn't giving me a wedding. He was buying an audience for his own ego, and I was the unwitting star of his tragicomedy. Without a word, I turned to Emily, ignoring the rest of the table, the rest of the room. I leaned in close, my hand still gripping hers, and whispered, "Are you okay?" Her eyes, shimmering with unshed tears, met mine. She gave me a small, shaky nod. "I love you," she whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." That was it. That was all I needed. Her words were a shield, deflecting all the poison my father had just spewed into the air. In that moment, we created a bubble, a small pocket of sanity and love in the middle of the madness. I lifted her hand to my lips and kissed her knuckles. It was a small gesture, but it was a declaration. My allegiance was here. My family was here. The man at the head of the table was just a stranger with a checkbook. My father, meanwhile, had already moved on. He was now holding court near the grand mahogany bar at the far end of the room, laughing with a state senator, his arm draped casually over the man's shoulder. He was back in his element, networking, making deals, projecting power. The toast was forgotten, a minor piece of business now concluded. He had put me in my place, and now he could get back to more important things. I watched him, and for the first time I didn't feel a sting of rejection. I felt a strange sort of pity for him. His world was so small, so transactional. He collected people and power the way other people collected stamps, but he had no idea what to do with love. He couldn't quantify it, so it held no value for him. A waiter came by to refill our champagne glasses. I politely put my hand over mine. I was done with my father's champagne, done with his celebration. This was my wedding now, Emily's and mine, and we would define it on our own terms. The cold resolve inside me began to solidify into a plan. It wasn't a plan for revenge, not in the way my father would understand it. It was simpler than that. It was a plan to just let the truth have its moment. I knew about the news segment scheduled to air tonight. My commanding officer had told me it might happen. A feature on our unit's recent success in thwarting a major cyber attack. I hadn't thought much of it, but now it felt like fate. I didn't need to say a word. I just needed to wait. The truth, unlike my father's opinion, didn't need an audience to be real. It just was. My best man, my oldest friend Jake, leaned over, his face a mask of controlled rage. "Dave, you want me to handle this?" he muttered, his eyes locked on my father, who was now schmoozing with some local developer. Jake was a Marine, built like a brick wall, and I knew his offer was genuine. But what would that solve? A scene? A fistfight at my own wedding? That would only prove my father right, that I was impulsive, undisciplined, and belonged in a world far from his polished sphere of influence. I shook my head, placing a hand on his arm. "No, let it go," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's not worth it." "He's not worth it." Jake didn't look convinced, but he respected my decision, settling back into his chair with a low growl of frustration. His loyalty was a balm on a very fresh wound, a quiet reminder that the family you choose can often be stronger than the one you're born into. Emily's brother Mark, a sturdy, kind-faced mechanic from Ohio, was less subtle. He came over to our table, his cheap rental suit looking uncomfortable on his broad shoulders. He completely ignored the chair offered to him and leaned down, his voice a low rumble. "David, just say the word. I'll go over there and explain to him in very simple terms what the word respect means." I saw in his eyes a fierce, protective instinct, the kind I had always craved from my own family. It was tempting, so incredibly tempting to just nod and let him unleash the righteous anger that I was holding back. But this was my wedding, and more importantly, this was Emily's family. I couldn't let my father's poison contaminate them too. "I appreciate that, Mark, more than you know," I told him honestly. "But please don't, for Emily. Let's just try to get through this." He looked from me to his sister, his jaw tight, and finally gave a reluctant nod. Watching Mark walk away, I was struck by the profound difference between our families. He probably made in a year what my father spent on a single vacation, but he possessed a kind of wealth my father couldn't even comprehend. It was a wealth of character, of fierce loyalty and uncomplicated love. Emily's parents, who were watching this exchange with worried eyes, had raised their children to value integrity over income, kindness over connections. They had welcomed me into their lives without a single question about my career prospects or my portfolio. They just saw the man who made their daughter happy. My father, with his German sports car parked ostentatiously out front and his name on half a dozen buildings in the city, was the poorest man in the room. He was utterly bankrupt in the things that truly mattered. The party continued, but the energy had shifted. A thick, awkward tension had settled over the grand ballroom. I could feel the whispers rippling out from our table. I saw the curious, pitying glances from distant relatives and the confused looks from Emily's friends. I felt like I was on display, a specimen of filial disappointment pinned to a board for all to see. My father had successfully turned my celebration into his personal theatre, and I was the tragic fool in the final act. Every clink of a glass, every burst of polite laughter from a faraway table, felt like a judgment. I tried to focus on Emily, on the warmth of her hand in mine, but it was like trying to hear a whisper in a hurricane. The humiliation wasn't a clean cut. It was a slow, seeping poison that was tainting every moment. Just as I thought things couldn't get more uncomfortable, one of my father's oldest business partners, a man named Arthur Harrison, made his way to our table. He was a large man who always seemed to be sweating, even in an air-conditioned room. And he carried the smug aura of someone who had never been told no. I braced myself for another condescending remark, disguised as a joke. "Richard's got a hell of a sense of humor, eh?" He chuckled, patting my shoulder with a heavy hand. "Don't you pay him any mind, son. We all know he's just disappointed you didn't want to print money with the rest of us." He winked as if we were sharing some secret, the casual dismissal of my life's work. The assumption that my only value could be monetary was almost as infuriating as my father's initial toast. He was reinforcing the narrative. I was the black sheep, the oddity who chose service over stock options. He wasn't finished. Leaning in conspiratorially, the smell of stale cigar smoke washing over me, he added, "My kid, Jonathan, just made partner at his law firm, 31 years old, bought himself a penthouse overlooking Central Park." He beamed with pride, then looked at me with a sort of feigned sympathy. "There's still time for you, you know. When you're done with this army thing, give me a call. I could find a spot for you in logistics. A real job." He said real job with an emphasis that made it clear what he thought of my current one. He was trying to be helpful in the only way he knew how, by offering me a path back to their world, a world where success was measured in square footage and year-end bonuses. He didn't see the insult. To him it was a generous offer, an olive branch extended to a wayward son. Before I could even formulate a response, Emily's voice cut through the air, quiet but with an edge of steel. "Mr. Harrison," she said, not looking at him but staring straight ahead, "David's army thing involves protecting the national power grid from foreign attacks. So when your son turns on the lights in his new penthouse, he can thank my husband for the fact that they actually work." The directness of her statement hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Harrison's jovial expression faltered. He blinked, completely thrown off balance. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a young woman he considered little more than a pretty accessory. He opened his mouth, then closed it, mumbled something about needing another drink, and shuffled away from our table, his retreat far less confident than his approach. A wave of fierce pride washed over me, so powerful it momentarily eclipsed all the anger and humiliation. Emily was my champion. In that one moment, she had shown more courage and loyalty than my own mother had in my entire lifetime. I glanced across the room and saw my mother, Susan, meticulously adjusting a floral centerpiece on a guest table, her face a perfect portrait of serene detachment. She was an expert at curating beauty, at ensuring every surface gleamed, every detail was in its place. She was maintaining the illusion of a perfect family, a perfect evening, while completely ignoring the emotional wreckage my father had caused. My wife had just defended my honor with a few sharp, well-aimed words. My mother was making sure the forks were straight. The contrast was a chasm I knew I could never cross again. The band, likely sensing the need for a distraction, launched into a classic Frank Sinatra song. The music was a forced injection of cheer into a room that desperately needed it. "Dance with me," I said to Emily, needing to hold her, to create our own space away from the prying eyes and whispered conversations. She nodded, her eyes shining, and let me lead her onto the polished dance floor. As we moved together, I could feel my father's gaze on us from across the room. It wasn't warm or paternal. It was the look of an owner surveying his property, a cold, appraising stare that judged everything and approved of nothing. But for the first time, it didn't make me flinch. I held my wife closer, burying my face in her hair, breathing in her scent. She was my country now, my flag, the only thing I needed to defend. Away from the table, wrapped in the music and the safety of her arms, I could finally breathe. "I'm so sorry, Emily," I whispered, my voice thick. "I'm sorry he ruined this." "He ruined it for you." She pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes, her expression firm. "He didn't ruin anything, David. He just showed everyone exactly who he is. Don't you dare apologize for him." She squeezed my hand. "I am proud of you. Do you hear me?" I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. It was then, over her shoulder, that my gaze drifted towards the bar. A large flat-screen TV was mounted high on the wall, its volume muted. It was tuned to a 24-hour news channel. I saw the familiar face of a primetime anchor, and then the chyron at the bottom of the screen scrolled past. Bold white letters, Pentagon Honors Elite Cyber Warfare Unit. My heart stopped. It was happening. Right now my blood went cold, then hot. It was like a jolt of electricity straight to the chest. a silent internal explosion that left me breathless. I was still holding Emily, swaying to the last few notes of the song, but my body had gone rigid. On that muted screen, behind the oblivious bartender and the shimmering rows of expensive liquor, was my entire hidden world about to be laid bare. The irony was almost too much to bear. My father had spent a fortune on this grand, opulent stage to publicly shame me, and in the background, on a forgotten television, the truth was quietly waiting for its cue. I held Emily a little tighter, my mind racing, trying to calculate the blast radius of what was about to happen. It wasn't a feeling of triumph. It was dread, pure and simple. I forced my feet to keep moving, to finish the dance as if nothing was wrong. My heart was a drum solo against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to turn, to point, to shout, "Look!" But that would have made me just like him, desperate for validation, craving the spotlight. This had to happen organically, or it wouldn't mean anything. I couldn't control this, and that was the terrifying beauty of it. All I could do was watch the pieces move into place. My eyes kept darting back to the screen, catching glimpses of stock footage, satellite arrays, complex lines of code scrolling past, the visual language of my life, completely alien to everyone in this room. To them it was just background noise. To me it was everything. I felt like a man watching a tidal wave form miles offshore, knowing it was heading directly for his shore. Over at the bar, the senator my father had been schmoozing with was ordering another scotch. He was a portly man with a booming laugh that seemed to fill whatever space he occupied. He and a few other men, all part of my father's inner circle of influence, stood with their backs to the television, deep in some conversation about tax codes or zoning laws. They were in their natural habitat, insulated by their wealth and power from anything that didn't directly affect their bottom line. The bartender, a young guy just trying to get through his shift, was the only one who seemed to notice the broadcast, his eyes occasionally flicking up to the screen with a flicker of detached interest. He was closer to my reality than anyone else in that room, and he didn't even know it. The music faded, and a polite smattering of applause brought me back to the moment. I needed a better view. "Let's get some air," I murmured to Emily, gently guiding her not towards the terrace doors but towards the edge of the dance floor, closer to the bar. It was a subtle shift, a strategic retreat that placed us in a perfect position to observe. She looked at me, her brow furrowed with concern. "David, what is it? You're pale." I couldn't tell her. It felt like trying to describe a color she'd never seen. How could I explain that my entire professional life, the one my father had so thoroughly mocked, was about to interrupt this perfectly orchestrated party? "It's nothing," I lied, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. "Just needed to catch my breath." I squeezed her hand, hoping it would convey everything I couldn't say. The news segment was now in full swing. I recognized the anchor, a serious, respected journalist. They were talking about the foiled cyber attack on the nation's financial infrastructure. I knew this story intimately. I had lived inside it for 2 weeks, subsisting on stale coffee and adrenaline, my team and I working around the clock to patch a vulnerability that could have crippled the U.S. economy. On the screen, they showed an interview with my commanding officer, General Miller, a man I respected more than my own father. His face was grim as he described the potential consequences, the chaos that had been narrowly averted. He spoke of a small elite team of digital ghosts who operated in the shadows. He was talking about me, and my father was across the room, laughing about a golf game. The memory of that operation came rushing back, so vivid it made the opulent ballroom feel like a cheap movie set. I remembered the bone-deep exhaustion, the frustration of hitting dead ends, the gnawing fear of failure. I remembered the moment we finally found the breach, a tiny, elegant piece of malicious code hidden deep within the system. The quiet, shared look of relief among my team members in the sterile, windowless room at 3 in the morning. That moment had felt more real, more meaningful, than anything I had ever experienced in my father's world of mahogany desks and 9-figure deals. He celebrated victories you could see on the skyline. My victories were invisible, a blackout that didn't happen, a market crash that was averted, a life that continued, uninterrupted and unaware of the danger it was in. Back in the present, I could feel the tension coiling in my gut like a spring. I stood with Emily by a small table near the edge of the dance floor, pretending to watch the other couples, but my focus was entirely on the bar. The senator, drink in hand, had turned slightly. His conversation had lulled, and his gaze drifted idly towards the television screen. It was a casual glance, nothing more. But it was a start. He was a man who dealt in information and power, and the words Pentagon and national security on the screen were like bait. I held my breath, watching, waiting for the hook to set. My father, oblivious, was now making his way towards the bar himself, no doubt to refresh his drink and continue holding court. The two most important men in my life, one who built me and one who broke me, were about to collide with a truth neither of them was prepared for. My father reached the bar and clapped the senator on the back, his voice booming. "Another one, John? You'll have to drive carefully in that new Porsche of yours," he joked. The senator laughed, but his eyes didn't leave the screen. He was leaning in slightly, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was listening, or rather trying to read the captions scrolling across the bottom. The anchor was now detailing the ceremony where the team was honored. The footage cut from the general to a closed-door event, a small, somber gathering in a secure room at the Pentagon. I knew this footage. I had been there. I had stood in that room and felt the weight of the medal being pinned to my chest, a weight my father could never comprehend. He thought value was something you wore on your wrist, not something you earned in silence. The camera zoomed in. There I was, younger, more tired, but unmistakably me. I was in my dress uniform, standing ramrod straight as the Secretary of Defense shook my hand. My name and rank were clearly visible on the screen, captioned for the whole world to see. The senator's jaw went slack. He took a step closer to the television, his expensive scotch completely forgotten in his hand. He squinted, his eyes widening in disbelief. I saw his lips form my name, a silent question. He turned to the man next to him, a real estate developer I recognized from my father's Christmas parties, and jabbed a finger towards the screen. The developer leaned in, his own expression shifting from mild curiosity to outright shock. The first domino had just been tipped over. My father, who had been trying to get the bartender's attention, finally noticed the senator's rapt focus. He followed his gaze to the television screen, a look of mild annoyance on his face, as if he were irritated that a news report could distract from his own performance. He saw the uniform first, then the face. I didn't need to see his reaction. I could feel it across the room. It was a sudden, sharp intake of breath, a disturbance in the air. The confident, commanding aura he projected simply collapsed. I saw the senator turn to him, his face a perfect mask of confusion and awe. "Richard!" the senator exclaimed, his voice cutting through the din of the party, loud enough for several nearby tables to fall silent. "My God, isn't that your boy? Isn't that David on the television?" The senator's voice wasn't a shout, but it sliced through the room like a blade. For a split second, nobody moved. The string quartet faltered, a single violin note hanging in the air like a question mark before dying out completely. Every single head in that grand ballroom turned in unison. First, they looked at the senator, then their eyes followed his pointed finger to the television above the bar, and finally, like a slow rolling wave, all 200 pairs of eyes landed on me. The silence was absolute. It was heavier and more suffocating than any noise I had ever heard. In that moment, I wasn't David, the groom. I was a puzzle that everyone in the room was suddenly trying to solve, and the missing piece was playing out in high definition on a muted screen. I didn't look at the screen. I knew what was on it. I looked at my father. I watched the entire universe of his certainty collapse in the space of 3 seconds. His face, which had been flushed with the self-satisfaction of a successful public shaming, went slack. The smug smile dissolved, replaced by a mask of pure, uncomprehending confusion. He squinted at the television, his head tilted as if he couldn't process the image his eyes were sending to his brain. He saw the uniform, the medal, the serious faces of government officials. He saw my face. The color drained from his skin, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. The titan of real estate, the man who controlled boardrooms and bent politicians to his will, suddenly looked like a small old man who had just seen a ghost. The bartender, seeing the sudden interest, fumbled for the remote and turned up the volume. The anchorwoman's crisp, professional voice filled the silent room, narrating the story over the footage. What a catastrophic attack on the nation's power grid, which experts say could have triggered a financial collapse rivaling the Great Depression. The camera was on me now, a tight shot of my face as I received the Distinguished Service Medal. The Pentagon has credited a small elite team of cybersecurity specialists, led by Captain David Miller. The words echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. Captain David Miller. Not the janitor. The official, undeniable truth was now a guest at my wedding, and it had a voice much louder than my father's. I kept my eyes locked on him. There was no triumph in me, no "I told you so." There was only a profound, cold emptiness. It was the feeling of a long, brutal war finally ending. I wasn't the victor. I was just a survivor. I watched him as the reporter continued, calling me one of the country's most vital yet unseen defenders. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not pride, but fear. It was the fear of a man whose entire reality, whose carefully constructed hierarchy of value, had just been publicly dismantled. He had built his world on the idea that my path was worthless, and the foundations of that world were now crumbling into dust on live television for all his important friends to see. A low murmur started to ripple through the crowd. I saw Arthur Harrison, the man who had offered me a real job in logistics, staring at the screen with his mouth hanging open. The state senator looked from the TV to my father and back again, an expression of dawning comprehension on his face. He wasn't just surprised. He looked betrayed, as if my father had been hiding an ace up his sleeve this whole time. The pitying glances that had been thrown my way all evening were now redirected with interest toward my father. He was no longer the powerful patriarch making a harmless joke. He was the fool who had no idea who his own son truly was. The power in the room didn't just shift. It reversed its polarity with the force of a lightning strike. I felt a squeeze on my hand and looked down. Emily was looking up at me, her eyes shining with tears, but this time they were different. They weren't tears of hurt or humiliation. They were tears of fierce, unadulterated pride. She didn't say a word, she didn't have to. Her expression said everything. Across the room, her father, the retired history teacher from Ohio, caught my eye. He wasn't smiling. He just gave me a slow, deliberate nod. It was a nod of profound respect, a silent acknowledgement that carried more weight and meaning for me than any medal from a general or any stock option from my father. In that moment, I knew I had all the family I would ever need. The approval I had chased my entire life had been sitting beside me the whole time. My father tried to regain his composure. He was a performer, and the show had to go on. He blinked, cleared his throat, and lifted his champagne flute to his lips, a desperate, reflexive gesture to project an air of nonchalance he was nowhere near feeling. But his hand was trembling. It wasn't a slight tremor. It was a violent, uncontrollable shake. The crystal flute rattled against his teeth. He couldn't hold it steady. As he tried to pull it away, the glass slipped from his sweaty, nerveless fingers. It seemed to hang in the air for an eternity before it fell, plummeting towards the gleaming white marble floor. The sound it made when it hit was like a gunshot, a sharp, explosive crack that shattered the last vestiges of silence and pretense in the room. The symbolism was so perfect, it was almost cruel. The champagne flute, the very instrument he had used to deliver his toast of humiliation, now lay in 1,000 glittering shards at his feet. The expensive French champagne, the symbol of his wealth and status, pooled on the floor like a spreading stain. For a long moment nobody breathed. All eyes were on the shattered glass, then on the man who had dropped it. He had wanted to make a toast, to be the center of attention, to define his son's failure. And he had succeeded. He was now undeniably the center of attention, but not as a king on his throne. He was a man exposed, his power as fragile and easily broken as the crystal he could no longer hold. He stared down at the broken glass, his face a canvas of disbelief and raw, public humiliation. He looked utterly lost. The mask of the powerful tycoon was gone, replaced by the face of a man who had just lost control of his own story in the most spectacular way possible. He looked up, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an ally, for someone to share a knowing glance with, but he found none. All he saw were the stunned, curious, and pitying faces of his peers, his friends, the very people whose respect he valued above all else. He had spent a lifetime building an empire of perception, and in less than 2 minutes it had been leveled by a force he never saw coming, the simple, unadorned truth. The senator was the first to move. He walked past my father without a second glance and came straight to me. He put a heavy, firm hand on my shoulder. "Captain Miller," he said, his voice booming with a newfound genuine respect. "Your father, he never told us. My godson, you're a national hero." Other people started to close in, my friends from my unit now beaming, the guests who had offered me awkward smiles now looking at me with something approaching awe. They started asking questions, their voices a low buzz of excitement. My father was left standing alone by the bar, marooned in a sea of his own making, a puddle of his spilled champagne spreading around his expensive Italian shoes. He was a ghost at my wedding. I didn't answer their questions. I didn't need to. I turned away from the crowd, from the senator, from the television that was now cutting to a commercial. I faced Emily, cupped her face in my hands, and kissed her. It wasn't a passionate kiss, but one of deep, quiet gratitude. It was a promise. "Let's go cut our cake," I said softly, my voice for her alone. She nodded, a beautiful, radiant smile finally breaking through her tears. I took her hand, and together we walked towards the towering white cake at the center of the dance floor. I didn't look back at my father. I didn't need to. His world was in pieces behind me. Mine was just beginning, right here holding my hand. We cut the cake. The simple act of slicing through the buttercream and sponge felt like the most normal thing in the world, a small ritual of order in the middle of chaos. The guests applauded, a little too loudly, a little too eagerly, as if trying to force the party back onto its prescribed track. A few feet away, a waiter was discreetly sweeping the shards of my father's champagne flute into a dustpan. The sound of the tiny pieces of crystal scraping against the marble floor was the only sound I really heard. My father hadn't moved. He just stood by the bar, staring at the spot where the glass had shattered, as if the pattern of the cracks held some answer he was desperate to find. He looked smaller, diminished, a king suddenly stripped of his crown in his own court. The power he had wielded just moments before had evaporated, leaving only a confused, aging man in an expensive suit. As Emily and I shared the first bite of cake, my father finally made his move. He approached us, his steps slow and uncertain. My mother trailed a few feet behind him, her face a practiced mask of neutrality. He didn't look at me. He looked at Emily. "That was quite a surprise," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He was trying to craft a new narrative on the fly, one where he was the proud, surprised father who had just been playfully kept in the dark. I saw the lie forming in his eyes. Before he could say another word, I stepped slightly in front of Emily. "We're going to go thank our guests now," I said, my voice calm and devoid of any emotion. I didn't call him Dad. I didn't call him anything. I just looked through him. For the first time in my life, I held his gaze without flinching, and he was the one who looked away. He just nodded, a slight jerky movement, and retreated. We didn't stay much longer. The atmosphere was irrevocably broken. The party had become a museum exhibit, with me as the main attraction, and my father as the fallen statue. We said our goodbyes to Emily's family, who hugged me with a warmth that felt like a shield. Her father clasped my shoulder, his eyes saying everything he didn't need to speak aloud. We thanked our friends who slapped me on the back with genuine, boisterous pride. We walked out of that grand ballroom, past the towering floral arrangements and the silent string quartet, and didn't look back. Leaving my own wedding reception felt like walking away from a shipwreck. It wasn't the joyful exit I had imagined, but it was a necessary one. It was the first step into a life that was truly mine, a life where I no longer had to perform for an audience of one. The next morning, my mother called. Her voice was strained, high-pitched with anxiety. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't congratulate me on my marriage. She went straight to damage control. "Richard is devastated, David," she began. "The senator called him this morning. Everyone is talking. You made him look like a fool." I listened in silence as she recounted the social fallout, the embarrassment, the sheer inconvenience of my truth. It was all about appearances, about the disruption to their carefully curated world. "Why didn't you just tell us?" she asked, her voice trembling with accusation. "Tell you what, Mom," I finally said, "that I wasn't a janitor? I thought you knew." The line went quiet for a long moment before she whispered, "Your father provides a beautiful life for us," and hung up. It wasn't an explanation. It was a confession. A week later, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived by courier. It was from my father's law firm. Inside there was no letter, no note, just a single formally drafted document. It was an amendment to the Richard Miller Family Trust. My name had been neatly and legally excised from every clause. I was officially disinherited. I stared at the paper, at the cold black ink that severed the last formal tie between us. I had expected it, but the finality of it was still a shock. Emily came and stood behind me, wrapping her arms around my waist and resting her chin on my shoulder. She read the document over my shoulder, and then gently took it from my hands, folded it, and put it in a drawer. "Well," she said softly, "now we don't have to go to his boring Christmas parties anymore." I laughed, a real, genuine laugh. The price of my freedom had a number, and it turned out to be a bargain. The story of the wedding reception became something of a legend in my father's circles. I heard bits and pieces of it later from one of the guys in my unit, whose uncle was in the same country club. Richard hadn't lost any deals over it. His money was still good. But he lost something far more valuable to him, his mystique. The narrative he had so carefully crafted of the all-knowing, all-powerful patriarch had been shattered. His peers no longer saw him as a titan, but as a man who was so blinded by his own ego that he didn't even know his own son was a decorated hero. He had tried to make me a punchline, and in the end he had become one himself. They said he stopped telling his little jokes at the bar. He just drank his scotch in silence. His empire was intact, but his kingdom had shrunk to the size of a single bar stool. Life moved on. Emily and I built our world in a small house with a leaky faucet and a yard that was mostly weeds, and it felt more like a palace than my father's mansion ever had. We filled it not with expensive art and crystal, but with laughter, with the smell of her baking, with late-night conversations about everything and nothing. My work remained classified, my victories invisible to the outside world, but they were no longer invisible to me. I carried a quiet confidence that wasn't dependent on a medal or a news report. It was forged in the knowledge that I had chosen my own path, and that the woman I loved walked it beside me, proud of every step. We found a wealth my father could never understand, a currency of trust and respect that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. About a year after the wedding, another package arrived. No return address, but I recognized my mother's elegant handwriting. Inside, nestled in a bed of black velvet, was the Rolex. It was gleaming, perfect, its steel bracelet cold to the touch. There was a small unsigned note card with 3 words written on it: "He is sorry." I stared at the watch, this object that had once symbolized everything I craved: acceptance, approval, a place in his world. Now it just looked like a piece of machinery. A well-made, expensive, and utterly empty thing. I closed the box and put it in the back of my closet, behind a stack of old yearbooks. It held no power over me anymore. It was just a reminder of a time when I thought a father's love had to be earned, a debt that had finally been paid in full. We never spoke again. I see his name in the financial pages sometimes, announcing a new skyscraper, a new acquisition. He's still building his empire of concrete and steel. I'm still building my invisible shields, protecting a world he'll never see. A few years ago, Emily and I had a son. When I hold him, I feel the weight of his small body in my arms, and I know with a certainty that settles deep in my bones that he will never have to wonder if his father is proud of him. He will just know. He will grow up in a house where his worth is not measured by his career choice or the price tag on his watch, but by the content of his character. My father's legacy is written on the skyline of a city. Mine, I hope, will be written in the heart of my son. And that, I've come to realize, is the only legacy that truly matters. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-confidence, please share this video with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not what others expect. Thank you for listening. Looking back on that night, I realized the most important thing that shattered on that marble floor wasn't a champagne flute. It was the invisible cage I had been living in my entire life. It was a cage built from the desperate need for one person's approval, a cage whose bars were forged from the belief that my worth was something he had to grant me. So many of us live in cages like that, don't we? We spend years contorting ourselves, trying to fit into a shape that someone else has designed for us. a parent, a boss, a society, hoping that if we just get it right, they'll finally see us. But the truth is, some people will only ever see what they want to see. The real moment of freedom isn't when they finally open the door. It's when you realize the lock was on your side all along. What I learned is that we all get to define what success means for ourselves. My father's world was built on things you could see, touch, and count. Buildings, bank accounts, luxury cars. His measure of a man was his net worth. For a long time, I thought that was the only measure that mattered. But my life, my real work, was happening in the spaces he couldn't see. It was about protecting things, not owning them. It was about service, not status. Your value isn't determined by the price of the watch on your wrist, but by the integrity you carry in your heart. It's not about the noise you make in the world, but about the quiet impact you have on the lives of others, even if they never know your name. That's a currency that never loses its value. I also learned that the word family has more than one definition. There's the family you're born into, the one that shares your blood and your history. And sometimes you're lucky, and that family is your greatest source of strength. But sometimes it's not. And that's when you have to be brave enough to recognize the family you choose. The family that chooses you back, not because of your last name or your potential inheritance, but because they see who you are at your core. The people who squeeze your hand under the table when the world is being cruel, who defend your honor without being asked, who offer you a place at their table without any conditions, that is the family that builds you up, and that is the foundation that can never be shaken. The greatest power, I've found, isn't in winning an argument. It's in no longer needing to have one. For years I had rehearsed speeches in my head, arguments I would make to my father to try and convince him of my worth. But on my wedding night I said almost nothing. My truth arrived on its own, not because I shouted it, but because I had lived it. You don't have to exhaust yourself fighting for your own dignity. Just live your life with purpose and honor. Let your actions be your voice. The truth has a weight and a gravity all its own, and eventually it will pull everything into its proper orbit. You just have to be patient and trust in the person you've worked so hard to become. My father spent his life building a legacy of steel and glass, things that could one day turn to dust. His name is on buildings, but a name on a plaque is just a ghost. I learned that a true legacy is invisible. It's the safety you create for others, the love you nurture in your home, the character you build in your children. It's the quiet ripple effect of a life lived with purpose. You don't need your name carved in stone to be remembered. You just need to leave the world a little safer, a little kinder, a little better than you found it. That's an empire no amount of money can buy, and no amount of time can erode. It's the only one that truly lasts. So if you're out there feeling unseen or undervalued by the very people who are supposed to be your champions, please hear me. Stop waiting for their permission to be proud of yourself. Stop measuring your life by their ruler. Your worth is not a negotiation. It is a fact. The path you've chosen, the work you do, the person you are, that is your truth. Own it, live it, defend it, not with anger, but with the quiet, unshakable dignity of knowing who you are. The applause you're waiting for might never come from them, and that's okay. The most important validation you will ever receive is the one that comes from looking in the mirror and respecting the person you see staring back. If this story resonated with you, or if you know someone who is fighting their own quiet battle for recognition, please share this with them. Sometimes, just knowing you're not alone is the first step toward finding your own strength. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about forging your own path and discovering that your true value comes from within. Thank you for letting me share my story with you.